Welcome to the Haven Collective. I'm J.R. Forasteros, and this is the Beacon Bit. Today we're reflecting on Revelation chapter 7 and the countless multitude that John encounters in heaven. I graduated from the University of Missouri, Columbia, also known as Mizzou, in 2006. Is that right? Yeah, 2006. Ooh, sorry about that. Had a little, senior moment. And I was grieved to hear this year that in the wake of many of Donald Trump's efforts to dismantle diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives, the university forced one of the Black student organizations to cancel its Black to School event because they said it is racially discriminatory and non-inclusive. Now, we don't have time today to get into it all, but the University of Missouri-Columbia has a long and problematic history with adequately representing its Black student body, which only comprise a little over 5% of the entire student body. But this in particular made me sad because it smacks of the charges of reverse racism that are very popular with people in Trump's movement. And reverse racism is one of those things, again, where we talk about like Black entertainment television and say, can you imagine how racist it would be if there was a white entertainment television? Again, to which most people say, well, like, that's just television, right? Or like, why don't we have a Black or a White History Month since we have a Black History Month and things like this? It's this sense that to celebrate and hold up one group of people who has been historically and contemporarily marginalized means somehow that we are ignoring the majority population. It ignores, frankly, the nuances of racism. It reduces racism to any singular act of exclusion because of race, without any context, without any history, again, without any nuance. And that is a sure sign that we're encountering the next tool of fascist and authoritarian governments that I want to talk about today, which is anti-intellectualism. It is incumbent on fascist movements and authoritarian movements to dismantle any sort of intellectual framework in a society. So you always see universities and schools being attacked. Again, no surprise that Trump has dismantled the Department of Education and has gone to war with some of our elite universities like Harvard and Yale and some of these. Because again, any sort of intellectual culture or framework is a death knell to the kinds of policies and behaviors that fascist dictators, demagogues, and movements want to inculcate in our culture. Here's what Jason Stanley says again. Fascist politics seeks to undermine public discourse by attacking and devaluing education, expertise, and language. Intelligent debate is impossible without an education with access to different perspectives, a respect for expertise when one's own knowledge gives out, and a rich enough language to precisely describe reality. When education, expertise, and linguistic distinctions are undermined, there remains only power and tribal identity. That's what's frightening to me, right? That ultimately the goal of fascist and authoritarian governments is tribalism, is reducing us down to an us versus them mentality, so that of course the us that is represented by the fascist or the authoritarian movement can reign supreme at the expense of all of the other thems. This is why I think Revelation 7 is so important, because again, Rome was very much that kind of authoritarian movement. If you were a Roman, a true Latin person, you had immense privilege over everyone else. Of course, if you were wealthy, you did as well. And Rome prized its education as far as it went, but they kept tight control over information and who was allowed to learn those kinds of things. So in contrast to that, we get Revelation chapter 7, where there are two groups that John gets to see, one on earth and one on heaven. And in the logic of Revelation, the group that is witnessed on earth is always mirrored by something going on in heaven. So they're meant to be sort of two sides of the same coin, an earthly and then an eternal incarnation. What the earthly group that John sees is the famous 144,000 witnesses that are gathered up from all the different tribes of Israel. And what they represent is not actually 144,000 ethnic Jews. They represent the church on earth. there's a long history in the New Testament of seeing the fledgling church as the heirs of God's people, that they incorporated the 12 tribes of Israel and became sort of the new 12 tribes. That's why Jesus chose 12 disciples and all of this. Paul talks about it a lot in his letters to the Galatians and to the Romans, that the first century church understood themselves to be part of God's people and heirs to all of the promises of God's people. Again, not the state of Israel, but the people, the Hebrew people, the people that God brought Gentiles into. So when we see this 144,000 here on earth, we're meant to understand that this is the church on earth. And they are sort of bound along ethnic lines, right? They're the 12 tribes of Israel, even though even in John's day, they knew that was not really quite right. But then we flip the camera up to heaven, and we see that the heavenly counterpart of the 144,000 on earth is this countless multitude from every nation, tribe, tongue, and culture. And this is powerful, because what we are not seeing is a bunch of people who used to belong to different cultures who have been assimilated into one. No, in fact, it's quite the opposite of that. It's that God brings them all together and celebrates them all as they are, and they're all singing together in this unified song in the midst of their diversity. So this is unity, that is not uniformity. This is a divine DEI where we are seeing the human project as God intended it from the beginning, not to be bound to one people, one ethnic group, one language, any of that, but to spread out, to be creative the way human culture is creative, to grow and evolve the way human culture grows and evolves, and then all of it to come together to represent this amazing, big, powerful picture of the image of God as reflected in all of humanity. This is not something that authoritarian regimes can abide. They don't have room for nuance or for difference. And so they insist on a lack of that. They insist on a monoculture experience. And that's why one of the best ways we can resist that is to celebrate diversity. Again, here's Stanley. Representing the voices of all those whose existence has shaped and formed the world in which we live provides an essential means of protection against fascist myth. Friends, if we want to be the church that God called us to be, we must celebrate and seek out and encourage diversity, because God created us that way. It's good and it's beautiful, and it's kryptonite to fascism. I look forward to discussing what that looks like, particularly in our current day and time, this coming Sunday in our Beacons. Until then, grace and peace go with you.